Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to step into a small coal town in West Virginia, the kind of place where December nights are cold enough to bite through your coat and the mountains crowd in like dark, silent witnesses. It's Christmas Eve, 1945, and the Sodder family house is glowing with laughter decorations and the warmth of a holiday that was supposed to be remembered for joy. Instead, it would become one of the most chilling, unresolved cases in American history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Maybe your town has its own mysteries, and who knows, maybe someone listening tonight is closer than you think. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The Sodder home stood on Route 16, a two-story wooden farmhouse with 10 children running in and out of its rooms. George and Jennie Sodder, Italian immigrants, had carved out a stable life from hard work in the coal trucking business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it meant that Christmas could be celebrated with stockings, little presents, and a big family meal. Their children, ranging in age from toddlers to young adults, were used to a strict but loving household, with George's fiery political opinions filling the kitchen air almost as often as the scent of Jennie's cooking. On December 24th, 1945, the house looked exactly how you'd imagine a bustling Christmas Eve should. A tree twinkled in the corner, candles flickered, and the younger children begged to stay up late. Marion, one of the older daughters, had come home from work at a dime store with a bag of little gifts for her younger siblings. Imagine their excitement, small toys, trinkets, candy, the kind of treasures that made children's eyes widen. The little ones, Martha, Jennie Jr., Maurice, Betty, and Louis, were thrilled. That night, the older Sodder children drifted upstairs to bed at different times. George Jr. and John, two of the older boys, were already asleep when Jennie told the younger ones they could stay up a little later if they wanted. After all, it was Christmas Eve. Midnight Mass had been celebrated in town, and the family had settled into that quiet window of time where one day turns into the next. It was ordinary, comfortable, safe, but not for long. Shortly after midnight, Jennie was startled awake by the sound of the telephone ringing downstairs. She padded through the dark hallway, picked up the receiver, and was met with a strange, slurred voice asking for someone she didn't know. Laughter and clinking glasses echoed in the background. Jennie told the caller they had the wrong number and hung up. But as she replaced the receiver, she noticed something odd. The lights were still on and the curtains were open. She thought the children had fallen asleep in the living room, but to her surprise, none were there. Assuming they had gone up to bed, Jennie turned off the lights, shut the curtains, and returned upstairs. Minutes later, she heard another noise, a loud bang on the roof, followed by something rolling off. The sound was sharp enough to make her sit upright in bed. But when the house stayed silent afterward, she convinced herself it was nothing unusual, just one of those winter noises you dismiss so you can drift back to sleep. At 1:00 a.m., Jennie awoke again, this time to a different sensation, the smell of smoke. Her eyes widened as she saw flames licking into George's office, which doubled as a storage room. The fire was spreading fast, roaring to life with terrifying speed. Jennie shouted for George and their older children. They scrambled to wake the household. In a blur of panic, Jennie grabbed little Sylvia, their youngest, from her crib. The family tumbled out of bed, choking on smoke, eyes burning, adrenaline pumping. The oldest kids, Marion, John, and George Jr., managed to escape through the thickening haze. But as the chaos unfolded, it became painfully clear that 5 of the Sodder children had not made it out: Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jennie Jr., 8, and Betty, 5. They were last seen upstairs, likely trapped in their rooms. George, frantic, rushed to grab the family's ladder so he could climb to the second floor. But when he reached its usual spot against the house, the ladder was gone. Not misplaced, gone. In desperation, he sprinted to his trucks, intending to drive them up to the house and climb onto the roof. But both trucks, which had worked perfectly the day before, refused to start. He tried one, then the other. Neither engine so much as sputtered. The fire consumed the house in less than 45 minutes, reducing it to smoldering ash. Neighbors gathered in the cold darkness, helpless, watching the flames devour wood and memory alike. When the fire department finally arrived hours later, the Sodders were left with nothing but ruins. 5 children gone, vanished in the fire, or so the official story went. But there was one strange fact that unsettled everyone: no remains were found. Not bones, not teeth, not ash fragments. Science tells us even in house fires, bones survive. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the fire could have burned hot enough to completely cremate 5 young bodies in such a short time. Some said it was possible. Others insisted it was impossible. And that is where the unease settled in. A Christmas Eve fire should have been the end of the Sodder children's story. But this one only raised questions. Questions that would haunt the family and America for decades to come. The Sodder family wasn't like every other family in Fayetteville, West Virginia. To really understand what made this case so haunting, you need to know who they were and why people whispered about them even before the fire. George Sodder had left Italy when he was a boy, never speaking much about why he had come to America. Some neighbors said he hated Mussolini with a passion, and others claimed he had enemies because of it. Whatever the truth, George built a trucking company from the ground up, hauling coal through the Appalachian hills. He was stubborn, proud, and outspoken. People either respected him or avoided him, sometimes both. Jennie, his wife, was the anchor of the house. Also an Italian immigrant, she was softer in tone but no less determined. She raised 10 children with equal parts discipline and affection, the kind of woman who could run a kitchen like a command post and still make time to sit quietly with a baby in her lap. Together, George and Jennie carved out a life that many immigrant families dreamed of: a house, steady work, and children filling every corner of their world. Their kids were the heart of their lives. Marion, the eldest daughter, was already working at a dime store. George Jr. and John, the older boys, often helped their father with trucking jobs. Then there were Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., and Betty, the middle cluster of kids who still loved toys and Christmas treats. Little Sylvia, just 2 years old at the time, was their baby. The house was never quiet. The Sodders weren't wealthy, but they were respected. Their home on Route 16 was modest, but it stood proudly against the rolling hills. George had built it himself, adding space as the family grew. In summer, kids tumbled outside playing in the grass while coal dust floated in the air. In winter, Jennie filled the house with warmth and food. Yet beneath this image of family success, there were tensions. George's views on Italy and Mussolini were widely known. He was never shy about criticizing the fascist leader, even in a small West Virginia town where some immigrants still admired Mussolini's strongman image. That kind of outspokenness didn't win friends. George had received threats before. Some said he should keep quiet or face consequences. He didn't. And so the Sodders lived in a strange balance: admired for their work ethic, envied for their large family, resented by a few who saw George's success and strong opinions as too loud, too bold. Christmas Eve of 1945 for them was a chance to push those worries aside. The war had ended just months earlier, and though America was still grieving its lost soldiers, the holiday carried a rare sense of peace. Marion had brought gifts for the younger children, a small act that made the night sparkle with joy. They sang, they played, they begged to stay up later than usual. George and Jennie gave in. It was Christmas after all. Imagine the glow inside that house: stockings, hung children whispering about Santa Claus, laughter echoing off wooden walls. Outside, the Appalachian night was cold and still. Inside, warmth filled every room. No one could have predicted how violently that warmth would be stolen. The Sodders' background mattered when the fire came. It shaped how neighbors talked afterward, how rumors spread. Was it a tragedy of bad luck, or was it something darker tied to George's enemies and the strange undercurrents of immigrant politics in post-war America? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the Sodder children were victims of fire alone or of something far more deliberate. And here's where a peculiar detail comes in. Earlier that year, an insurance salesman had warned George that his house might burn down and take the children with it if he didn't buy a certain policy. George dismissed him, calling it intimidation. But in hindsight, that comment felt less like sales pressure and more like a threat. Life for the Sodders right up to the night of the fire was a mixture of hard work, resilience, and subtle fear. That's why when the house burned down and 5 children disappeared without a trace, the story didn't stay just a tragedy. It became a question mark that no one could erase. Remember this: fires burn homes, yes, but families like the Sodders carry flames of their own. Pride, stubbornness, love, those were the embers under everything. and maybe, just maybe, those embers threatened someone enough to want them extinguished. The night of the fire plays out like a sequence you wish you could rewind, slow down, and change, but it moved too fast for anyone to stop it. Every small decision, every overlooked sound, every minute that passed became another piece of the mystery. Just before midnight, the Sodder home was still alive with Christmas spirit. Marion had passed out the presents, and the younger children had been thrilled. Betty clutched her new toy like a treasure. Jennie Jr. and Louis whispered excitedly about Santa Claus. Maurice and Martha, a little older, laughed at their younger siblings, but still joined in on the fun. When Jennie, their mother, told them it was bedtime, they pleaded to stay up later. Jennie gave in, telling them not to stay up too long. She believed they would soon drift off to sleep anyway. George Jr. and John had already retired to their bedroom upstairs, tired from working that day. Marion slipped away to her own room. Jennie went to bed thinking everything was in order, but that wrong number call pulled her back into the night. That phone call is one of the strangest elements of the night. A woman's voice slurred, laughing in the background, asking for someone Jennie didn't know. Was it a coincidence, a prank, or was it a distraction timed to wake Jennie to unsettle her? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether that call was random or part of something more calculated. Then came the sound on the roof. Jennie described it later as a heavy thump followed by a rolling noise. Some neighbors speculated it could have been a piece of burning debris. Others wondered if it was something thrown deliberately, perhaps even an incendiary device. Remember, this was a coal town, and dynamite and fuel were familiar enough. The idea of sabotage wasn't far-fetched. When Jennie awoke again at 1 a.m. to smoke filling her room, the quiet of Christmas Eve turned to horror. She rushed to wake George, who immediately tried to gather the children, but the smoke and flames were already too much. Here's how the escape unfolded. Jennie grabbed Sylvia, the baby, from her crib and rushed outside. Marion, already awake, made it out with her mother, George Jr., and John managed to climb out coughing and confused. But the 5 children, who had been given permission to stay up, they were gone. No cries for help, no movement at the windows. They had been last seen alive only an hour earlier. George's first instinct was to get to them. He ran to the side of the house where the ladder always leaned, ready for emergencies. But the ladder wasn't there. It was later found tossed down an embankment far from the house, as though someone had moved it intentionally. He sprinted to his trucks, 2 of them parked nearby. He'd used them both just the day before, and they had worked perfectly. But now, in the most critical moment, neither would start. He turned the ignition, pumped the gas, tried again and again, but both were dead. 2 trucks failing at once, coincidence or sabotage? Neighbors ran to help, but the fire was too fierce. In less than 45 minutes, the Sodder home collapsed into ash. All anyone could do was watch as the flames devoured everything. By the time the fire department arrived hours later, because of wartime staffing shortages and poor communication, there was nothing left to save. The surviving family stood barefoot in the snow, stunned, watching the glow fade to embers. But something was wrong. Fires consume wood, paper, fabric, but bodies, even in the hottest house fires, bones remain, teeth survive. Yet when investigators sifted through the ashes, they found nothing. No skulls, no fragments, no traces of 5 children. The official explanation was that the fire had burned so hot, so completely, that nothing remained. But scientists and fire experts later argued this was impossible. A blaze like that simply couldn't erase 5 human bodies in under an hour. Jennie, in particular, refused to accept the explanation. She tested it herself, later burning animal bones in her kitchen stove for hours. They never fully disintegrated. She knew something was wrong. That night should have ended in grief. Instead, it opened a door into decades of questions. Where were the Sodder children? Were they really taken by the fire, or had they vanished in a way no one expected? The town whispered about George's enemies. They remembered the salesman who had warned of fire. They remembered George's loud criticisms of Mussolini. And they wondered, was the fire just a fire, or was it the cover for something far more sinister? The unanswered questions began piling up that very night, rising like smoke that refused to clear. And with each oddity, the phone call, the missing ladder, the dead trucks, the story became less about tragedy and more about mystery. In the smoke-filled chaos of that early morning, survival was both miracle and torment. George and Jennie had escaped, but the thought of their 5 missing children pulled at every nerve in their bodies. Imagine standing barefoot in the snowskin, singed from running past flames, listening for cries that never came. The horror of knowing your children might still be inside, yet being powerless to reach them. It's the kind of memory that etches itself into bone. Neighbors who rushed to the scene could only watch as the Sodders tried everything. George, in desperation, even attempted to scoop water from a nearby barrel to douse the flames. But in the freezing night, the water was solid ice. He hacked at it with bare hands until his skin split, but it was no use. Jennie clutched little Sylvia to her chest, rocking back and forth as the inferno roared. The older children, Marion, George Jr., and John, stood nearby in shock, their faces lit by orange light, their voices hoarse from smoke. For them, survival didn't feel like relief. It felt like failure. By the time the house collapsed, the Sodders' lives had been split in two before the fire and after. The official story when it came later was that Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie Jr., and Betty had been consumed by the flames. But in the moment as the fire dwindled into smoldering ash, George and Jennie refused to believe that. Here's why. Even in the immediate aftermath, details didn't add up. The missing ladder, both trucks failing at once, the strange thump on the roof, and Jennie's memory of that eerie phone call. These weren't just coincidences stacked together. They felt like a pattern, one with sinister intent. The fire department, understaffed and poorly equipped, didn't arrive until sunrise. Chief Maurice, leading the effort, offered little reassurance. He suggested the fire had been caused by faulty wiring and that the children's bodies had simply been cremated by the blaze. But George didn't buy it. He had recently had the wiring inspected and deemed safe. And again, no bones, no teeth, not even ash fragments that could belong to 5 small bodies. This is where the Sodder case swerved sharply away from the category of tragic accident into unsolved mystery. Fires destroy homes, yes, but families knew from experience that human remains always left something behind. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Chief Maurice's conclusion was a hasty cover to avoid further panic or whether he genuinely believed it. What's clear is that George's despair quickly turned to obsession. Standing in the rubble, he clawed through the ashes with his bare hands, desperate to find even a single bone. He found nothing. Jennie, shaken, began to notice other details. The smell of kerosene lingered stronger than expected. The pattern of the fire didn't look right, burning too fast, too hot, and she kept replaying the sound she'd heard on the roof, the thump, the rolling noise, wondering if it had been the moment the fire truly began. Meanwhile, John and George Jr., the 2 older boys who had escaped, gave conflicting stories about whether they had tried to wake their younger siblings. Some say shock clouded their memories. Others whispered that maybe they had been told to stay silent about what they'd really seen. That inconsistency only added another layer of unease. And then there was the strangest absence of all silence. Not one cry from upstairs, no screaming children at the windows, no pounding footsteps. 5 young voices should have been heard, but there was nothing. The Sodders would not accept that their children had burned completely in less than an hour without leaving a trace. So they began to consider the unthinkable. Maybe the children hadn't died at all. Maybe they had vanished in another way. That seed of suspicion planted in the cold dawn of Christmas morning would grow into a lifelong quest. George and Jennie would never stop digging, never stop asking questions, never stop chasing whispers across states. But before their search truly began, they had to face the official line that no one wanted to cross. The authorities said their children were gone, and the fire was the explanation. And yet the ground beneath their feet told them otherwise. The fire had taken their home, but had it really taken their children, or had someone else? The surviving Sodders were left with dread, heavy as the winter air. And in that dread, in those unanswered questions, suspicion began to take root like smoke seeping into fabric it would never wash out. When dawn broke on Christmas morning, the Sodders' land looked like a battlefield. Charred timbers smoldered. The sweet smell of pine from the family's Christmas tree was replaced by acrid smoke. What had been a home only hours earlier was now nothing more than a jagged black scar on the hillside. And in that ash, the most painful truth seemed unavoidable. 5 children were missing. But missing in what sense? Burned away entirely as the fire chief insisted, or gone spirited away into the night? George and Jennie couldn't let go of the second possibility. The ruins offered no evidence of bodies. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the house could have burned hot enough to erase every trace of flesh and bone. But most experts later said it was nearly impossible. Even crematoriums designed specifically to incinerate bodies leave behind large bone fragments requiring grinding afterward to reduce them to ash. How could a wooden house fire in under an hour do more? The absence of remains was more than unusual, it was haunting. So much so that neighbors began to speculate in whispers, perhaps the children had been taken before the fire started. But if that were true, that's where the evidence starts to twist. Jennie remembered the phone call, the thud on the roof. George remembered his ladder missing, his trucks failing to start. Put together, these details suggested a kind of sabotage, a deliberate plan. And then came the first chilling revelation: the Sodder's telephone line had been cut. Not melted, not burned through, but cut cleanly as if by hand. That discovery was the first tangible proof that something had happened before or during the fire that didn't fit with the story of a tragic accident. The missing ladder added to the mystery. It wasn't until days later that George found it tossed down an embankment far from the house. How had it been moved? Who would take the time to remove the family's only means of reaching the second floor in an emergency, unless, of course, that was the point? And the trucks, George had maintained them meticulously. They had been in working order the day before, but in the moment of crisis, both failed. Later examinations offered no clear reason. Some believed fuel lines had been tampered with. Others suggested sugar might have been poured into the tanks, clogging them. Either way, the coincidence of two vehicles breaking down at once was staggering. George began to replay the night in his mind, searching for clues. He remembered seeing a stranger parked along the road days earlier, watching the Sodder children as they came home from school. Another man had approached George with an offer of insurance, warning that his house could burn and his children would be destroyed if he didn't cooperate. George had dismissed it as nonsense. Now it seemed less like nonsense and more like prophecy. Jennie, meanwhile, grew more and more convinced the fire hadn't killed her children. She studied every detail of the ruins. She spoke with neighbors. She ran her own experiments, burning chicken bones and beef bones in her stove. They never disappeared, always fragments remained. If that was true for animals, why would human bones vanish without a trace? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Jennie's experiments proved anything scientific, but for her, the results were clear. Her children had not been consumed by the fire. Something else had happened. The official conclusion, however, was different. The fire marshal filed a report stating faulty wiring caused the blaze. The death certificates listed the children as victims of fire. And with that, local authorities considered the matter closed. No further investigation, no search for the missing. For George and Jennie, that was unbearable. They had lived through horror, but what they were being asked to accept felt worse than grief. It felt like a lie. Christmas morning should have been filled with torn wrapping paper, squeals of joy, and the chaos of too many children playing with new toys. Instead, it was silence. Smoke rising into a gray sky. A family standing barefoot in ashes, clinging to each other, wondering if 5 children were gone or if they were out there somewhere waiting to be found. And so what began as dread hardened into suspicion. The Sodders would not let the matter rest. If the authorities would not search for answers, they would. They were parents and their children had vanished. Fire or no fire, they were not done. Suspicion turned quickly into action. George and Jennie weren't people to sit back and let fate dictate their lives. After all, George had come to America as a teenager with nothing but determination, and he had built a business from the ground up. Now that same stubbornness fueled a new mission, uncovering the truth about what happened to his children. The first step was bringing in outside voices. George contacted private investigators while Jennie reached out to relatives and anyone who might listen. And when the local authorities brushed them off with their tidy explanation of faulty wiring, the Sodders began to dig deeper on their own. One of the earliest signs came from witnesses. Several people came forward claiming they had seen the Sodder children alive after the fire. A woman working at a local motel reported seeing them the very next morning eating breakfast accompanied by two men and two women. Another claimed to have spotted them peering from a passing car window. These stories varied in detail, but one strange thread tied them together: the children never appeared distressed. It was as if they had been removed from their home without a struggle, placed into the custody of people they knew or feared enough not to resist. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these accounts were reliable memories or simply fueled by the notoriety of the case. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously fragile. But for George and Jennie, these were rays of hope in a sea of ashes. The Sodders also hired the help of a pathologist to examine the site again. This expert sifted through the debris with more care than the local fire crew had ever shown, and he found something unusual: a small collection of human vertebrae. At first glance, this seemed like the discovery the Sodders had dreaded, proof that the fire had claimed at least one child. But when the bones were sent to a lab, the conclusion was baffling. They belonged to someone much older than the missing Sodder children, likely a person in their late teens or early 20s. Stranger still, the bones showed no evidence of exposure to fire. They seemed to have been planted in the rubble after the fact. So how did bones belonging to someone else entirely end up in the remains of the Sodder home? Was it sloppy investigation, a cruel hoax, or evidence of a conspiracy meant to cover up the truth? By now, the Sodder case was spreading beyond Fayetteville. Newspapers across the region began running stories, fascinated by the combination of mystery and tragedy. And with each article, more tips and theories trickled in. Some pointed to organized crime. Others suggested political enemies of George had targeted him. Remember, George was an outspoken critic of Mussolini and fascism, a stance that had earned him enemies in the local Italian immigrant community. In fact, one man had warned George outright, "Your house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed." Was that just an ugly threat, or a plan spoken aloud? The Sodders' investigation gained urgency when they realized something else chilling. The fire trucks had taken nearly 7 hours to arrive that night, despite being located only 2 miles away. The fire chief later admitted he didn't know how to operate the trucks and had to wait for someone who did. Convenient incompetence or intentional delay to ensure the house was gone before the children's fate could be uncovered. Everywhere George and Jennie turned, they found walls. Officials refused to reopen the case. The death certificate stayed on file. Friends who had once offered sympathy began urging them to move on. But the Sodders wouldn't. They couldn't. 5 children were missing. If they were alive, they needed rescuing. If they were dead, the parents needed proof. Either way, closure was impossible without answers. It was Jennie who became the emotional center of the search. She refused to give away the children's clothes. She kept their Christmas presents unopened in the ruins. She began corresponding with psychics, detectives, even strangers from across the country who claimed they had seen or sensed something. Most of these leads fizzled out, but a few left shivers down her spine. One psychic wrote that the children were being held by strangers and would never be returned. Another insisted they were alive in another state, being raised under false names. As outlandish as these claims seemed, they kept the flicker of hope alive. And then came the photograph. Years later, Jennie received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a photo of a young man in his 20s. On the back was a handwritten note: Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. I lil boys. Ain't I 132 or 35? The young man looked strikingly like her son Louis might have grown up to look. Same dark eyes, same stubborn jawline. Was it him? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the photo was authentic or a cruel prank. But for Jennie, it was confirmation her children had not perished in the fire. They had been taken, hidden away, and for reasons she could never understand, kept from her for the rest of her life. By this point, the Sodder home was gone, replaced by a memorial garden. But in the space where grief might have closed a door, George and Jennie made a different choice. They built a billboard. It was enormous, looming over Highway 16, with photographs of the missing 5 children and bold letters offering a reward for information. Travelers from miles around saw it. Year after year, the billboard became a landmark, a constant reminder that the Sodders' tragedy was not finished. People whispered that the Sodders were obsessed. Others admired their determination. Either way, the case refused to fade into the past, because what lingered wasn't just sorrow, it was mystery. Missing children, an unresolved case, a sibling mystery that remained unsolved long after the smoke had cleared. And if the Sodders had anything to say about it, the world would never forget. The deeper the Sodders dug, the stranger the details became. Imagine your George on that freezing Christmas night, the fire blazing, your children screaming upstairs, and you sprinting outside in desperation. The ladder you always kept leaning against the side of the house was missing. The water barrels were frozen solid. And when you rushed to start your coal trucks to ram the house and create an escape route, both engines refused to turn over. Now here's the eerie twist: those trucks had been working perfectly just hours earlier. George had used one that same afternoon to haul coal, and the other had no mechanical problems. Yet that night, as flames consumed the house, both machines were dead. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was simple bad luck, a mechanical fluke caused by the cold weather, or deliberate sabotage by someone who didn't want the children rescued. Later, George remembered a man who had come to the Sodder home in the weeks before the fire looking for work. He had wandered around the property eyeing the trucks and even remarking that one of the fuse boxes looked like it could cause a fire someday. At the time, George brushed it off as small talk. After the fire, though, it looked like foreshadowing. Adding to the suspicion, a neighbor reported seeing someone steal the Sodders' ladder that same night. It was eventually found tossed down an embankment near the property, far from where George always kept it. Coincidence, maybe. But how many coincidences does it take before a story stops sounding accidental? Meanwhile, investigators from the local fire department weren't helping. Their explanation was still painfully simple: the children had died in the blaze, and the fire destroyed their remains completely. Yet Jennie wasn't convinced. She began experimenting in her own quiet way. She tested burning piles of bones, even small animal carcasses, in outdoor fires to see how long it would take to reduce them to ash. The results were always the same, even after hours of roaring heat. Bones remained. So how could an ordinary house fire, which burned for less than an hour before the roof collapsed, completely annihilate 5 human bodies? That question kept Jennie awake at night. And there was more. Witnesses said they saw strange figures lurking around the Sodder home before and during the fire. One woman claimed she saw someone throwing balls of fire at the house. Days later, George found a small green object in the yard, a kind of rubber casing, charred and twisted, resembling a napalm pineapple bomb used during World War II. The idea that someone might have deliberately firebombed the Sodder home was terrifying, but it also fit too neatly with the odd details to ignore. Even stranger, in the weeks before the fire, the Sodder children themselves had noticed a man watching them from a parked car along the road. At the time, no one thought much of it, but afterward, those memories grew more sinister. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these sightings were real threats or just the paranoia of a traumatized family reconstructing events in hindsight. But the Sodders believed them. With every new detail, the narrative of accidental house fire unraveled further. By now, George's frustration with the authorities was boiling over. He suspected corruption, or at the very least, negligence. The fire chief, Maurice, had behaved oddly from the start, delaying the investigation, claiming he had found heart-shaped organs in the ashes and then burying them in a box on the property without showing the family. When the box was later unearthed, it contained nothing but beef liver untouched by fire. What kind of investigation was that? The sense of dread deepened. If someone had wanted the Sodder children gone, they had succeeded. If someone had wanted the truth buried, the authorities seemed strangely cooperative in letting it happen. George became obsessed with retracing every step. He rebuilt parts of the house in his mind, imagining where the children had been. He replayed the night over and over. Could they have escaped on their own? Were they kidnapped in the confusion? If so, who had the motive? Theories sprouted like weeds. Some neighbors whispered about revenge from enemies George had made by criticizing Mussolini. Others suggested organized crime connections, pointing to the mafia's presence in the Italian-American community. Maybe the children had been taken as leverage to silence George or to punish him for his outspokenness. Still, no ransom note ever came. No demands were made, just silence. This silence was almost worse than an answer. For George and Jennie, it meant living in the limbo of uncertainty. Were their children alive, growing up in another town under different names, or had they perished, their remains hidden or destroyed in ways beyond comprehension? Every broken truck, every missing ladder, every cut phone line pushed the Sodders closer to believing this was no accident. It was something darker, something carefully planned. And the cruelest part, whoever was behind it, had managed to make the children vanish into thin air. The Sodders' private suspicions had already grown into a storm, but now they were about to collide with the official version of events. When the local coroner's jury declared the 5 missing children legally dead victims of the house fire, George and Jennie felt as if the ground had been ripped out from beneath them. There had been no thorough search, no proper investigation, and certainly no bodies. Yet paperwork closed the case, just like that. For the Sodders, this was unacceptable, and their refusal to accept it made them pariahs in their own small town. Fayetteville was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. Some neighbors whispered that George and Jennie were in denial, clinging to impossible hope. Others thought their public campaign for answers was an embarrassment, stirring trouble in a community that preferred tidy explanations. But none of that mattered to the Sodders. They weren't fighting for appearances, they were fighting for their children. Jennie, in particular, refused to give in. Each morning she woke with the same thought: there was no proof the children had died. That simple truth was enough to keep her searching. She began keeping a journal of every strange event, every lead, every inconsistency in the official story. It read like a catalog of unanswered questions. Take the phone line, for instance. Investigators concluded it had been burned in the fire, but an electrician later showed George the wires had been deliberately cut, not melted. That meant someone had been outside tampering with the lines right as the fire began. If the children were still alive, this suggested they hadn't just vanished, they had been taken. Another chilling discovery came when neighbors admitted to seeing someone at the Sodder home while the blaze still roared. A passerby told police he saw a man trying to steal a block and tackle from George's property that night. Another said he watched a stranger toss something fiery onto the roof. Neither of these accounts had been included in the initial investigation report. Why were they ignored? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these testimonies were credible or exaggerated in hindsight. But for George, they were pieces of a puzzle that pointed away from accident and toward conspiracy. The most haunting detail, though, was the total absence of remains. Experts in fire science later explained that even in extremely high-temperature blazes, bones rarely burn completely. At least fragments should have survived. The Sodders clung to this fact like a lifeline. If there were no bones, then the children hadn't died in that fire. Period. Yet the fire chief, Maurice, behaved in ways that only deepened suspicion. When pressed by George, he admitted he had found something during his search, a heart-shaped organ in the ashes, which he had secretly buried in a box on the property. When the box was later dug up under police supervision, its contents turned out to be raw beef liver, untouched by flame. Was this incompetence, deception, or something far more sinister? The contradictions piled up. George began pressing harder, traveling to Charleston and beyond to demand that state authorities intervene. He wanted the governor, even the FBI, to step in. At one point, J. Edgar Hoover himself wrote a letter saying he was willing to help, but the local authorities had to invite federal agents into the case. Fayetteville's sheriff declined. The door slammed shut. So the Sodders turned their grief into fuel. They refused to be silent. George began contacting anyone with power: senators, governors, journalists, and when doors closed in their faces, they kept knocking anyway. It was around this time that the Sodders started hearing stories of their children being seen alive. In a diner in a nearby town, a woman swore she had served breakfast to 5 children resembling the Sodder kids, accompanied by 2 unfamiliar adults. A waitress in another county said she spotted them weeks later, escorted by strangers who refused to let them speak. A hotel clerk in Charleston insisted the children had stayed there, registered under false names. Were these cases of mistaken identity or fleeting glimpses of a hidden truth? The Sodders believed the latter. They began chasing these stories across counties, following every rumor. Each lead was a thread of hope. Each dead end was another heartbreak. But the strangest part was how quickly the local community turned against them. Instead of helping, many Fayetteville residents dismissed their claims as fantasy. Why were people so determined to pretend the case was solved? Was it collective denial, or was someone trying to bury secrets that the Sodders were dangerously close to uncovering? By now, their home site had become something of a shrine. Jennie refused to rebuild. Instead, she tended to a flower garden where the house once stood, planting rows of vibrant blooms in memory of her missing children. To outsiders, it looked like obsession, but to Jennie, it was the only place where she could feel close to them, a space where hope and grief coexisted. The Sodders were no longer just parents. They were detectives, campaigners, and guardians of a mystery that official channels had abandoned. And the deeper they looked, the more the cracks in the official story widened. Because this wasn't just about a fire anymore. This was about missing children, an unresolved case, and a family refusing to accept silence as an answer. It began with whispers, quiet mentions from strangers, notes passed along, stories exchanged in confidence. If George and Jennie thought the trail was going cold, the sightings of their children reignited everything. The first report came just days after the fire. A woman driving through Fayetteville swore she had seen the Sodder children peering out from a passing car window, their faces pale but unmistakable. She thought they looked frightened, but before she could react, the car was gone. Then in Charleston, nearly 50 miles away, a hotel clerk told investigators that she remembered 5 children checking in with 2 men and 2 women, all strangers. The adults had insisted the children stay quiet and not interact with others. The detail that stuck with her was the way the youngest girl kept looking over her shoulder, as if searching for someone she recognized. Weeks later, a woman running a roadside cafe near Fayetteville reported serving breakfast to 5 children who matched the Sodders. They were accompanied by adults again, insisting on silence. The waitress said she remembered because the kids looked so much like the ones on the missing posters that had already begun circulating. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these were legitimate sightings or merely cases of mistaken identity amplified by grief and gossip. But the consistency of the reports, the same number of children always with adults always kept quiet, gave the Sodders reason to believe. Each sighting pulled George and Jennie deeper into a web of possibility. Could their children really be alive, hidden in plain sight, shuffled from place to prevent discovery? If so, why? Who would take them, and for what purpose? Some locals suggested the children had been kidnapped by a child-selling ring. Others pointed to George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini as a motive. Perhaps fellow Italian immigrants loyal to the dictator had taken revenge, punishing George by taking what he valued most. In fact, George remembered a strange encounter just weeks before the fire. A man had come to the house looking for work, then warned George that his house would burn and his children would be destroyed. At the time, it sounded like nonsense. After the fire, it felt like prophecy. Jennie held on to the hope those sightings offered. She replayed them over and over, picturing her children being moved from place to place, maybe under new names, maybe forced to forget where they came from. It was a cruel hope, but hope nonetheless. And then came the strangest tip yet. A woman who had been at the fire scene said she saw a man moving quickly away from the Sodder home with a child in his arms. She thought it odd at the time, but assumed he was helping. Later, she realized no child had ever been accounted for. That single image, an unknown man carrying a child through the flames, haunted George and Jennie. Who was he? Why had no one else noticed? And where had he gone? The Sodders clung to these stories, even as skeptics rolled their eyes. "People see what they want to see," the sheriff remarked dismissively. But George wasn't buying it. He began traveling further, chasing rumors beyond Fayetteville, sometimes across state lines. One night in 1947, a few years after the fire, George drove to the state capitol to meet with a minister who claimed he had information. Instead of answers, George was met with threats. The man warned him to stop asking questions, saying, "If you keep digging, you're going to cause more harm than good." George returned home shaken but undeterred. If anything, it convinced him he was closer to the truth than ever. Meanwhile, Jennie turned inward. She spent sleepless nights pacing the house, replaying the fire in her mind. She wrote letters to anyone she thought could help: the FBI, the governor, newspapers across the country. Most went unanswered, but every now and then a journalist would take interest. Each article sparked a new wave of tips, some hopeful, some cruel hoaxes. The cruelest came in the form of prank calls. Strangers phoned in the middle of the night claiming to have seen the children, only to laugh before hanging up. It was torture, But it also proved that the Sodder case was becoming infamous, the kind of unresolved mystery that invited obsession. One strange fact kept surfacing in George's mind: the fire trucks had taken nearly 7 hours to arrive. Not minutes, hours. When they finally did, the fire was out the house, a smoldering shell. The fire chief later admitted he didn't know how to drive the trucks, so he had to wait for someone else. Convenient incompetence or deliberate delay? Investigators and detectives are still debating that very question. Each layer of the story pushed the Sodders further from closure. Their children hadn't simply vanished into the flames, they had been erased as if by design. And the sightings, real or not, made that erasure feel incomplete. It was as though the Sodder children were shadows glimpsed just beyond reach, haunting their parents in life rather than in death. When whispers weren't enough, George and Jennie made their message louder, much louder. By the early 1950s, they had saved enough to commission what would become one of the most famous billboards in American true crime history. It rose high above Route 16, not far from the site of the old Sodder home, a towering declaration of defiance. Painted across the wood were the faces of the 5 missing Sodder children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, beneath a stark message: 5 of our children missing. What was their fate? Kidnapped, murdered, or burned? The billboard also offered a reward for information. It wasn't just a plea, it was a challenge to anyone who knew something and thought the family would eventually give up. George and Jennie weren't going anywhere, and they wanted the whole world to know it. The sight became unforgettable. Travelers passing through Fayetteville would slow their cars, staring at the children's faces, the bold words, the sense of unfinished business. For some it was heartbreaking, for others unnerving. Either way, the Sodders had made their grief impossible to ignore. Strange as it may sound, the billboard became almost like another member of the family. George repainted it every few years, updating the reward amount, touching up the fading images. It stood there for decades, looming over the highway like a ghost. People gave directions based on it. Go past the Sodder children billboard and turn left, they'd say. The missing siblings had become woven into the geography of West Virginia itself. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the billboard was an act of stubborn hope or an unhealthy obsession. But to George and Jennie, it was their loudest weapon. If officials wouldn't investigate, then the court of public opinion would, and the billboard worked. Leads continued to pour in. Some were vague, others oddly specific. A traveler in Texas swore he saw children resembling the Sodders at a carnival. Another man claimed the children were in Florida, living under new identities. The most bizarre came from a woman in St. Louis who said Martha was living in a convent, cloistered away from the outside world. Each story sounded far-fetched, but George followed up on many of them, sometimes driving hundreds of miles to chase a rumor that fizzled out. And then came the letter. In 1967, more than 2 decades after the fire, Jennie received an envelope postmarked from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his 20s with dark hair and piercing eyes. On the back was a handwritten message: Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. I lil boys. A91 32 or 35. The resemblance was chilling. The man in the photo could have been Louis grown up, same jawline, same eyes, the same faint smirk. George and Jennie showed the picture to friends, relatives, even strangers, and nearly all agreed it looked like Louis. But the cryptic note raised more questions than it answered. Who was Frankie? What did a lil boys mean? And what about that strange number? Was it a code, a zip code, a military unit? George immediately sent a private investigator to Kentucky to track down the letter's source. The man took the assignment, disappeared into the state, and was never heard from again. No report, no update, just silence. Had he been silenced, or had he simply walked away, overwhelmed by the case's notoriety? The letter became one of the most unsettling clues of all. Even skeptics admitted that if it was a hoax, it was a cruelly convincing one. And if it wasn't, then Louis, at least one of the children, had survived. Jennie kept the photograph framed on her mantle until her death. For her, it was proof the children hadn't died in that fire. Proof that the official story was wrong. Proof that somewhere out there, her son had grown into a man. The Sodder billboard remained year after year, a testament to this belief. Visitors who came to Fayetteville couldn't miss it. Some snapped photographs, others wrote about it in travel journals. And for those who grew up in the town, it was simply part of the landscape: 5 faces, staring down at you every time you pass by. But the more the case stayed alive in public memory, the more resistance the family faced. Authorities grew tired of being pestered with questions. Locals muttered that George and Jennie should stop dragging Fayetteville's name into national headlines. At times, the Sodders were treated as nuisances rather than victims, yet they pressed on. Because behind the fading paint of that billboard wasn't obsession, it was love. Love that refused to accept silence. Love that demanded the world keep looking, keep wondering, keep remembering. Because 5 children don't just vanish. Not without someone knowing why. The years rolled forward, but for George and Jennie, time felt stuck. Every holiday, every birthday, every quiet evening at the dinner table was marked by 5 empty chairs, 5 voices missing from the conversation. The silence was deafening, and the billboard outside their home became a substitute for those missing voices. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Sodder case had become almost folklore. Tourists and journalists alike passed through Fayetteville to see the billboard. The story was retold so many times that details blurred, but one thing never changed: the sense of unfinished business. And yet, despite their perseverance, George and Jennie were human. Age weighed heavy, and the unrelenting grief took its toll. George in particular bore the marks of frustration. He had chased leads for decades, driven thousands of miles, and spent countless dollars on private detectives' letters and newspaper ads. Still, no concrete answers came. One day in 1969, George suffered a stroke. The man who had once climbed ladders and shouted at suspicious firefighters was suddenly frail. Still, when reporters asked if he had any last words about the case, he said quietly, "Time is running out, but I'll keep searching until the day I die." He did. In 1969, George passed away at the age of 73, taking with him the weight of unanswered questions. At his funeral, friends and neighbors whispered not just condolences, but lingering theories. Some claimed the children had been taken by organized crime. Others insisted there was a government cover-up. Some still believed it was just a fire tragic but ordinary. But George had never believed that, and neither did Jennie. Jennie carried the torch with a fierceness that shocked even her family. She refused to wear anything but black for the rest of her life, a permanent symbol of mourning. Neighbors who passed her house saw her standing in the yard tending to the flower beds she had planted near the billboard, her black dress billowing in the West Virginia wind. For Jennie, each flower was a prayer, a silent message to her missing children: "I haven't given up on you." Strangely enough, Jennie herself became almost a figure of legend in Fayetteville. Kids whispered stories about the woman in black who still believed her children would return. Teenagers dared each other to drive past her house at night and catch a glimpse of her in the window. Some said her devotion was heroic. Others said it was madness. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Jennie's refusal to accept the fire was grounded in logic or fueled entirely by grief. After all, experts had gone back and forth on whether bones should have been found, whether the wiring could have caused the fire, whether the family's leads were credible. There was no consensus, only layers of contradictions. And contradictions breed suspicion. In the 1970s, a new wave of amateur sleuths and writers became fascinated by the case. The rise of true crime magazines meant more exposure, and Jennie welcomed anyone willing to listen. She gave interviews, showed the photograph of the young man she believed was Lewis, and repeated her mantra, "My children did not die in that fire." But as the decades wore on, even Jennie had to confront the reality that she might never see them again. Still, she never stopped hoping. The photograph of the young man remained on her mantel. The billboard remained outside. The flowers remained in her garden. And when Jennie passed away in 1989 at the age of 85, she left behind not just her surviving children, but an entire community haunted by one of the strangest mysteries in American history. The billboard stayed up for a few more years after her death, cared for by the remaining Sodder siblings. Eventually, weather and time wore it down until it was finally removed in the late 1980s. For the first time in decades, Route 16 no longer bore the faces of the missing 5, but by then the story had already taken on a life of its own. For some, the Sodder children were a cautionary tale about the fragility of family. For others, they were symbols of hope against impossible odds. And for true crime enthusiasts, they were and still are one of the most maddening unsolved cases of the 20th century. because the clues were always just enough to keep you wondering. The bones that never appeared, the photograph with its strange code, the rumors of mafia ties, foreign kidnappings, and hidden convents. Every piece of the puzzle led to another question, another dead end. Even as time marched forward, the Sodder case refused to settle quietly into history. The Sodder children's disappearance didn't just vanish into the quiet halls of Fayetteville history, it became a story that rippled outward across counties, across states, and eventually across oceans. The case had all the ingredients of a chilling, unresolved mystery: children vanishing in the night, conflicting evidence, and parents who never gave up. By the 1990s, the case had turned into something larger than just a family's heartbreak. It was being taught in criminology classes, analyzed in mystery magazines, and passed around internet forums as one of the original cold cases before that term even became trendy. People everywhere were asking the same thing: how could 5 children disappear without a trace? For the Sodder siblings who survived that night, life moved forward, but never far enough away. They grew older, had families of their own, but every Christmas dinner, every reunion, there was a shadow at the table. They still remembered their father pacing with a flashlight in the yard, their mother kneeling in black in her garden. And they remembered the voices, the theories, the strangers who claimed they had seen Louis, Martha, Betty, Jennie, and Maurice alive. Sylvia, the youngest Sodder child, just 2 years old at the time of the fire, became one of the last torchbearers of the case. She grew up under the shadow of the mystery, raised in a home where every question about her siblings was met with whispered theories and clippings from newspapers. By adulthood, she had inherited not just her parents' grief, but their determination, and Sylvia never wavered. She once said, "I've lived my whole life wondering what happened to them." That statement wasn't just an echo of her mother's obsession, it was a vow. Strangely enough, the story continued to generate bizarre new twists even decades later. In the 1990s, a letter surfaced, another photograph, another cryptic note. Like the infamous Louisville photograph, this too hinted that one of the missing boys had survived. But just like before, the lead fizzled into uncertainty. Investigators couldn't trace the source. The handwriting analysis went nowhere, and the family was left with the same question: were these cruel hoaxes or fragments of truth? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these photos were genuine attempts at communication or elaborate pranks that preyed on the Sodders' desperation. Because in unsolved cases, hope itself becomes a double-edged sword, a reason to keep searching, but also an opening for manipulation. By now, the Sodder mystery had become what you might call a living legend. True crime radio shows, late-night documentaries, even ghost stories started attaching themselves to the case. Some said the Sodder children haunted Fayetteville, their spirits restless, because their bodies were never laid to rest. Others whispered that one of the siblings had secretly come back, living quietly under a new name, unwilling or unable to reunite with the family. None of those tales were proven, but they show just how deeply the disappearance burrowed into the imagination of the public. Meanwhile, the surviving Sodder children carried their private theories. Some still believed the mafia had been involved, that George's outspoken criticism of Mussolini had angered powerful men. Others leaned toward the fire being a cover for a botched kidnapping, that the blaze was meant to destroy evidence and distract from what was really happening outside that night. And a few perhaps reluctantly admitted that the simplest explanation, that the children perished in the fire, was still possible. But even they couldn't ignore the inconsistencies: the ladder that was missing, the phone lines that were cut, the absence of bones or remains. As the case entered the digital age, the Sodder disappearance took on a second life. Online sleuths armed with forums and message boards pored over every scrap of evidence. Amateur investigators used Google Maps to trace possible routes the children could have been taken, compared handwriting samples on the mysterious letters, and debated whether modern forensics could solve what 1940s science could not. And yet, no matter how many fresh eyes examined it, the same conclusion emerged: it was maddeningly unsolvable. But that's what kept the case alive. For those who loved the Sodder children, it was unbearable not to know. For those who studied the case from the outside, it was irresistible, a puzzle with too many missing pieces, a story too strange to dismiss and too haunting to forget. As the 20th century ended and the surviving Sodder siblings aged into their 70s and 80s, they faced the same reality their parents once had the answers might never come. Still, they passed the story to their children, their grandchildren, making sure the names of the missing five, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, would never disappear into silence. The Sodder disappearance was no longer just a family's private grief. It had become part of American folklore, a sibling mystery that refused to fade. As the calendar moved into the 2000s, the Sodder case, once whispered in West Virginia kitchens and debated in smoky, small-town diners, was now being picked apart under the glow of computer screens. True crime blogs, podcasts, and television specials resurrected the story for a new generation. And if there's one thing about unsolved mysteries, it's that they never really die. They just wait for a new set of eyes, a new audience ready to obsess. For Fayetteville locals, though, the case was more than just internet fodder. The town itself had changed, growing from its coal mining roots into a quieter Appalachian stopover. But the shadow of the missing Sodder children still lingered. Tourists would occasionally drive into town just to ask about the house fire that wasn't, and older residents would point out the hillside where the Sodder home once stood. For the family, especially Sylvia and her children, the internet age brought both relief and renewed pain. Relief because the story was being told again, keeping the five missing siblings alive in memory. Pain because every retelling meant reopening wounds, dredging up theories, and enduring the skeptics who accused George and Jennie of having been delusional. The billboard was long gone by this time, but Sylvia kept the memory alive in interviews. She described the night of the fire. Even though she had been so young, she remembered more of her parents' grief than the flames themselves. What haunted her most wasn't the fire, it was her mother's unwavering conviction that her siblings had survived, and the way that conviction had shaped her entire life. And then there was that photograph, the one sent in the 1960s, with the strange scrawled handwriting on the back. Sylvia kept it framed even decades later, wondering if she was staring at the face of her brother Louis. By the 2000s, with advances in facial recognition technology, amateur sleuths ran analyses comparing the photograph to childhood images of Louis. Some said the similarities were uncanny. Others dismissed it as coincidence. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether modern forensic tools could definitively answer the photo question. But the truth is, the trail was cold long before DNA databases and advanced algorithms came into play. If that man had really been Louis, he would have been in his 50s or 60s by then. If not, the photograph was just another cruel twist in an already tangled mystery. But technology did something else. It connected strangers across the globe who were captivated by the Sodder case. Online forums brimmed with theories. Theory 1. The mafia abducted the children to send George a message. Theory 2. The fire was staged and the children were sold or given to another family. Theory 3. The Sodder children died in the fire and the lack of remains was a tragic anomaly. Theory 4. Something darker. A government cover-up, a hidden adoption ring, an inside job. The debates never ended and probably never will. Meanwhile, as Sylvia grew older, she clung to what her parents had taught her, that family never truly disappears as long as you speak their names. She spoke those names, often keeping alive the memory of her missing brothers and sisters. In one interview, she recalled her father's desperation the night of the fire, the way he had tried every tool, every tactic, even bare hands, to reach the children. The way he collapsed in the snow, defeated, his breath fogging in the winter air as the house burned behind him. That image, she said, stayed with her all her life, a reminder of how fiercely her parents had fought and how bitterly the mystery had stolen their peace. By the time the story reached modern podcasts and YouTube channels, the Sodder children were no longer just missing, they had become a cultural riddle. People consumed the story not just for its tragedy, but for its sheer strangeness. The cut phone line, the missing ladder, the unburned basement, the false leads, the photograph with cryptic writing. It felt like a story designed to keep you awake at night, replaying the details over and over, knowing you'll never find a neat conclusion. That's what makes the Sodder case different from so many other unsolved mysteries. It wasn't just a disappearance. It wasn't just a fire. It was a collision of both, an event where every fact seemed to create two new questions. And in that way, the Sodder children never really vanished. They live on caught in a perpetual loop of speculation, forever frozen on the night of December 24th, 1945. By the time the story had passed into the 2010s, the Sodder disappearance had become less about solving a case and more about preserving a legacy. The surviving siblings were elderly, some already gone, and the children and grandchildren of the Sodder family now carried the weight of the mystery. For them, it wasn't simply an old family tragedy, it was a defining story that shaped their identity. If you think about it, that's one of the strangest details of this case. The fire itself lasted only a few hours, but the aftermath stretched across generations. One night of chaos carved a scar that lasted more than 70 years. Even in the age of DNA kits and genealogy databases, no definitive proof emerged to confirm or deny George and Jennie's lifelong belief. Some researchers suggested that if bone fragments could still be recovered from the original site, modern science might finally answer the question of whether the children perished there. But others doubted anything meaningful remained. Time, weather, and construction had all altered the landscape. And so investigators and detectives are still debating whether science has anything left to uncover, or whether this is simply a case destined to remain unresolved. Meanwhile, the Sodder disappearance found new life in pop culture. Documentaries revisited the story, each adding its own angle, some focusing on the potential mafia connection, others on the psychology of grief, and still others on the symbolism of Jennie's lifelong mourning. True crime podcasts treated it as one of the great founding myths of unsolved mysteries, the kind of story that set the tone for generations of fascination with cold cases. Sylvia, until her death in 2021, continued to share her memories. She remained adamant her siblings had not died in that fire. Her conviction echoed her mother's words, and her refusal to let go mirrored the same steel George had carried to his grave. It was as if the mystery itself was a family heirloom passed down alongside photo albums and old stories. The strange thing is how deeply outsiders connected to this pain. People who had no ties to West Virginia, no link to the Sodder family, still found themselves emotionally invested. They debated on Reddit threads late into the night. They wrote speculative fiction about what might have happened. They made YouTube videos with millions of views, their comment sections filled with strangers confessing they couldn't stop thinking about the 5 missing children. Why? Because this story wasn't just about crime, it was about the most primal fear of all: children disappearing in the night, families left with silence instead of answers. It tapped into something universal, something everyone can feel in their bones. And there's another unusual detail: the Sodder case almost perfectly straddles the line between rational explanation and eerie myth. On one hand, it could be chalked up to a devastating house fire with tragic quirks in the evidence. On the other, the coincidences, the cut phone line, the missing ladder, the photograph, decades later, make it feel like something out of a gothic mystery novel. No wonder people are still hooked. As the years rolled on, the Sodder name became etched into the broader lore of American mysteries, standing beside cases like the disappearance of Amelia Earhart or the fate of D.B. Cooper. The children themselves, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty, were no longer just missing kids from a coal town. They had become symbols, embodiments of the unanswered, of the way life sometimes withholds closure. And yet, if you drive through Fayetteville today, you won't find much left to mark the case. The billboard is gone. The house site has been repurposed. The town itself has moved on. But if you ask the right people, if you dig into the right archives, you'll hear the whispers. The Sodder children are still there, hidden, not in the earth or in the ashes, but in the imagination of everyone who hears their story. The night of December 24th, 1945, still echoes today, not with flames, but with questions. 5 children tucked into bed, a sudden fire, a frantic rescue attempt that fell short. That's where the story should have ended, with tragedy and mourning. But instead, the Sodder case became something else entirely, an unsolved riddle that refused to close. By the 2020s, the case had cemented itself as a permanent entry in the canon of unresolved mysteries. Entire YouTube channels, podcasts, and documentaries devoted episodes to the Sodder children, often ranking it among the top 10 most baffling disappearances. People across the world, from Europe to Asia, heard the tale and shivered at the thought: how could 5 siblings just vanish without a trace? For Sylvia's children and grandchildren, carrying the story forward was both an honor and a burden. They answered interview requests, reshared the photograph of the young man, who might have been Lewis, and continued to ask the same questions that George and Jennie had asked decades earlier. Each generation inherited not just the mystery, but the responsibility of keeping the children's names alive. But the case never gave them peace. Instead, it hovered like a ghost demanding attention, forcing them to live in the shadow of the unsolved. And that's what makes this case so enduring. It is not just about the facts, the cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the lack of remains, the photograph mailed from nowhere. It is about what those facts symbolize: the fragility of safety, the cruelty of uncertainty, and the impossible task of grieving when you don't know what you've lost. Strangely, people who study the case often describe it as a kind of puzzle you can't stop picking at. You turn over one piece, the photo, the mafia theory, the supposed sightings, and it only leads to another gap. You go in circles just like George did on his desperate drives across states, just like Jennie did in her black dresses, just like Sylvia did in her interviews. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the Sodder disappearance was simply a tragic accident misunderstood through grief, or whether it was a genuine case of abduction and cover-up. Both explanations have merit. Both explanations leave holes. And neither explanation satisfies the gnawing sense that something more was happening in Fayetteville that night. The truth may be gone forever. Maybe the children did perish in the fire, their remains hidden by chance and circumstance. Maybe they were taken spirited away into new lives they could never escape. Or maybe the real answer lies somewhere between a version no one has yet dared to imagine. But one thing is certain: the Sodder children did not disappear into silence. Their names, Maurice, Martha, Louise, Jennie, Betty, are spoken aloud by strangers who never knew them 70, 80 years later. They are remembered, debated, and mourned not only by their family, but by the world. And maybe that is its own kind of survival. So tonight, as you think about their story, picture the flicker of that Christmas Eve fire. Hear the sound of George's footsteps pounding in the snow, Jennie's cries piercing the dark, the surviving children huddling in fear. Picture the billboard by Route 16, weathered by decades of rain and wind, staring out into passing headlights with 5 pairs of eyes that never gave up. And then let it fade. The fire goes dark, the billboard crumbles, the voices soften. What remains is the question: what happened to the Sodder children? Maybe someday we'll know. Maybe we never will. The story of the Sodder children isn't just about one family's grief. It's about how a single night can ripple outward, touching strangers decades later, across oceans, across generations. It's about how mysteries resist silence, how they find ways to live on through photographs, rumors, and whispered theories. Even now, people are still searching, not necessarily for bones or evidence, but for understanding. They scroll through forums at midnight, replay podcast episodes, pause on blurry photographs, and wonder, could that be him? Could that be her? And in a strange way, that's what keeps the Sodder children alive. They are not forgotten. They are part of the fabric of unsolved history, forever caught between fire and disappearance, between accident and conspiracy. When you hear their story, you might think of your own family, of the people you love most. And you might feel that quiet dread that comes when you realize how fragile life is, how quickly everything can change. But you might also feel something else: the power of remembrance. Because the Sodder case shows us that memory is a kind of defiance. As long as we keep speaking their names, the children never fully vanish. So tonight, as you let your eyelids grow heavy and the story lingers in the quiet of your room, carry with you the simple truth: not every mystery ends, but not every mystery is meant to. Some are here to remind us of the questions we must live with and the hope we must never let go of.